Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome to this webinar of the Migration Policy Center. It's the third webinar this academic year. My name is Martin Roos. I'm the Deputy Director of the MPC. The theme of today's webinar is the relationship between development aid and migration flows. And as many of you will know, there's been significant research on this issue in recent years. There's a lot of policy interest in this question, specifically in the question whether and how foreign aid affects migration flows from lower income countries to higher income countries. How we want to add value to this research and debate today is by focusing on types of migration that have perhaps been a little bit under-researched in this overall area and policy debate. So specifically, we're going to look at the relationship between foreign aid and flows of refugees, flows of irregular migrants, and foreign aid and internal migration flows. And to discuss these issues, I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers. I'll introduce them briefly. You have their bios in the invitation that you were sent. We have Sarah Langlotz, who's Assistant Professor in Development Economics at the University of Göttingen. She will talk about foreign aid and refugee flows. We're pleased to welcome Paul Clist, who is Associate Professor of Development Economics at the University of East Anglia. Paul will talk about foreign aid and irregular migration. And third, Mauro Lanati, who is a research fellow here at the MPC, mainly working on the MEDAM project. And Mauro will talk about foreign aid or development aid and internal migration. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the way we usually work our webinars is we have the three presentations, 15 minutes each, followed by a question and answer session. Because we have very large numbers, if you have a question, please write your question in the chat box on YouTube. And it'll be my job as chair to field the questions then after the presentations are all done. So if you have a question, please write it down in the chat box. And please also indicate who the question is for. So that'll make my life easier. So with that, let's go ahead and Sarah, you're up first.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I will just start sharing my screen. Give me a second. So can you hear me and do you see the screen? I hope so. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm very happy that I can present here today. I present a paper which is joint work with Axel Trier and Andreas Fuchs, and it's called The Effects of Foreign Aid on Refugee Flows. We were actually starting to work on this paper about 4 years ago, so already quite a while ago. And it was at the same time when the topic received much more attention in the media because of the European refugee crisis that just arrived and basically in Europe. And I think we all remember pictures and statements as this one. Here you can see Angela Merkel, who says that development cooperation could be an instrument to tackle the causes of flight. I think you also remember that this was not the only perspective that many politicians took, but we also know that politicians engaged in many so-called refugee deals. So here you see again Angela Merkel, but with a different expression on her face, and the Tunisian president, Youssef Chahed, and they are talking about a so-called refugee deal. So it's about a development cooperation project of about 250 million euros in exchange for faster repatriation. And interestingly, during the time of the refugee crisis and the years after, many donor countries and many European countries provided much more development aid to recipient countries. And for instance, for Germany, it was in 2016, it was the first year that they were actually achieving the goal of 0.7% of national income. So many countries actually increased aid at large numbers. And in my paper with Axel Trier and Andreas Fuchs, we want to address these two perspectives, basically. So we first want to take the perspective of recipient countries and ask the question, does aid help refugees stay? By doing so, we look at the net flows of refugees to the entire world. But we also take the perspective of donor countries, or at least of some politicians, who were asking whether aid keeps refugees away from their countries. And therefore, we look into the net refugee flows to OECD countries. Just to give you an idea about the numbers, in 2019, there were about 80 million people that were forcibly displaced worldwide. This is about the population of Germany. We also see here that about a third of that, 26 million, were actually refugees. And refugees are the focus of this paper. And as we just heard, we will hear about more papers looking into more irregular types of migration. A lot of the literature is so far focused on more general or broad migration, but there's not so much on irregular types or refugees. What you also see here is that the numbers are rising since about 2012. So it was already before the refugee crisis hit basically Europe that the numbers were already rising, but nothing really happens at that time. Only later donors were providing more aid. So let's have a look at how the data would look like when we look into the maps on a very average countrywide perspective. So what you see on the upper map is the total bilateral aid as a % of GDP. And in the lower map, you see net refugee flows in logs. And first of all, you see, well, these are to some extent, basically only covering the developing world with some exceptions. But you also see that the darker blues and lighter blues in the two maps do not tell a very clear story. So when we would look into general correlations, we wouldn't identify a clear pattern. So this is why in this paper, we try to do a more rigorous analysis to identify the effects of aid on refugee flows. And we do so by running an empirical model where we have the different definitions of refugees, one to the world and the other one to OECD countries only, as our main outcome variables. We then look into the effects of aid, but we take different legs of aid because the timing is really not clear. And there are so many mechanisms at play that we wouldn't really know when should we even expect the effect to happen. And this is why for all analysis, we look into different types of legs. We also account for some push factors, just as conflict or some humanitarian crisis, and also account for different sets of fixed effects. One main contribution about this paper, apart from the focus on refugees, is also that we are able to cover a very large set of countries of origin, so countries that receive aid and are also the origin countries of refugee flows. And we also are also able to look at a very long time frame. So we have 38 years in our analysis. Just on a side note, we also do the analysis at different levels. We have period level data, but also at a yearly level. One main concern is it still looms large in this analysis because development aid is endogenous in this setting. As I've just shown you, many donors only started to react once they were actually affected more directly because they were receiving many refugee flows. And this is really making it hard to disentangle the direction of the effect. And there's also many more other variables that are affecting both aid and refugees. And this makes the causal analysis very complicated. And this is why in our analysis, we provide an empirical model based on an instrumental variable approach. And here we base some exogenous variation on electoral outcomes in the donor countries based on the literature, also one of my earlier papers where I established this instrumental variable. And this is basically the interaction of donor government fractionalization with the probability of receiving aid. The combination of these two variables varies both across recipient countries, those are origin countries, and across donor countries. And you now might ask yourself, why in the hell should donor government fractionalization affect aid flows to countries? So there is also an established literature showing that the more fractionalized the government is, the higher the budgets are in general. And with higher budgets in general, we also have higher aid budgets. And this leads on average to larger aid flows to specific countries. The first part of this causal link mechanism is just driven by the fact that when you imagine that different parties sit together to define the budget, all have their own areas in mind that they want to address, and nobody would be happy to cut in their own areas. So the overall budget is likely to increase. For those that are interested in the method, we can also discuss it more in the Q&A, but just one way of also how you can think about it is a bit in a difference in difference approach, because you can compare the effects of aid on refugee flows in irregular and regular recipient countries when the level of donor government fractionalization changes. And what we basically aim at is we want to have a look at aid as if it would be given at random, because we want to avoid to only look into purposeful aid, only the aid that is given because they want to reduce the flows. And this is why we use this approach. Let's have a look at the results. So I was saying that we have two basic questions that are rather different, address different directions of how you think about this topic. The first one was whether aid helps that people can stay in their home countries. And we do find effects of it, of aid on refugee flows to the world, but only in a very long-term perspective. So what you see here in the different columns is just a different lag structure of aid. At the beginning, in a more short-sighted time frame, we do not see any effect, but in the long term, we see that aid leads to less refugee flows. When we then have a look into the question, does aid keep refugees away, really the perspective of some politicians, we see in fact in the very short-sighted time frame, we actually see an increase of those going to the donor countries, but only in the very long term, we again see a reduction. I can also illustrate this like maybe in a bit nicer way when we look at the yearly data. You also see that on the left-hand side, looking at the total refugee flows to the world, we see at the beginning no effect, but it turns significant only in the very long term. When we look into those going to the donor countries, which are a lot of these European countries, we see that at the beginning, we see a positive effect, which also turns negative, but only slightly significant at a very long-term time frame. And we couldn't go further in the lag structure because our data is limited. So now let's have a quick look on how can we explain this finding. Well, one explanation would be that maybe aid is in fact helpful to tackle the root causes of flight, but only in a long-term time frame. And I will show you results in just a second. Another explanation would be that aid improves the donor's image in the recipient countries, which unfortunately we don't have any data for, at least not for like the entire set of donor countries and the large set of origin countries. But we can rely on the literature that has shown that aid indeed improves the donor's image in recipient countries. We can then also ask ourselves, so what happens? Maybe aid is not leading to more flows, but maybe more people are internally displaced, or are more people going to specific sets of countries? And finally, we can have a look into different types of aid, because not all aid is alike, and some types of aid might be more effective also at a short-term time frame, which is in particular interesting humanitarian aid, because this is really directed as a disaster relief and to provide shelter and food aid. So let's have a quick look only into the results. I show you only the results on the first mechanism that actually for which we find evidence. So when we're looking at the effects of aid on growth, we find a positive effect only in the very long-term time frame again, which could be which fits very well our other timing. If people are actually better off in the long term, then they might not need to flee anymore. And this kind of relates back to one earlier webinar series where we discussed the migration hump, I think. And so this one would would be helpful to say why our effects are only at the long-term time frame. So when aid increases income, people might not need to flee. When we then have a look into are people internally displaced, so where do they go apart from the donor countries, we actually find that also aid leads to more internally displaced people. We also see that it also leads to more people to transit countries or neighbors in a short-term time frame. And this is important because most of the top hosting countries are not the European countries, right? With maybe a few exceptions, but in general, these are the direct neighbors to the countries at crisis, and these are like transit countries, just as Turkey. And we see that there's also positive short-term effects. So it's not only the donors that receive more in a short-term time frame. We could then also ask ourselves, when the donors don't give aid to the country itself, but to its neighbors, how does this affect the flows? And what we see is that indeed, when donors provide aid to the neighbors, it reduces the flows to themselves. So then the flows to the OECD countries are reduced. How can we explain this result? Well, this might just be because there were refugee camps built, or neighbors strengthen border controls because of some of these refugee deals. The last mechanism I want to talk about quickly is about humanitarian aid. When we look into this type of aid and have a look how large the share of humanitarian aid should be to see any effects, we find actually that the higher the share of humanitarian aid, then we also can see that there's a reduction in the short-term time frame. But this is only the case if the share of humanitarian aid exceeds 9% of total ODA, which is rather large. So in general, the average would be 2% in my sample. So it can be only very few cases where this is the case. But this could be in a very useful way to provide much more help at a shorter time frame. So to conclude, in the short run, we don't find evidence that aid reduces refugee outflows. This holds true when we look into the flows to the donor countries. But we find that there are short-term effects when the share of humanitarian aid is high. In the long run, we find that evidence in line of aid reducing refugee outflows because of tackling the root causes, which would be a very good outcome in terms of the development perspective. And this is the case for worldwide flows and flows to the OECD countries. So when you take the perspective of a politician again, aid is no short-term panacea, but it might be effective in the long run. But effectiveness can mean different things here, because we always have to ask ourselves whether it's good for the people to stay in their region, or whether it's actually better, whether they would be in fact better off if they could go to OECD countries or further countries away. And we also, just one side note, we were looking at exogenous aid as if it would be given at random. But if we would look into purposeful aid, the aid that is given to directly affect refugee flows, this might have a different outcome. That's it, basically, what I want to say. Thank you so much for your attention. And I will look forward to your feedback after the other presentations.
Thank you very much, Sally, for a really interesting presentation, and also for sticking to time so well. I think it was just under 15 minutes, so perfect. We'll go straight to Paul and the second presentation. Paul, you have to unmute yourself. I think you're on mute.
I don't know if you muted me. It doesn't say I'm on mute.
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much to everyone else for organizing. The paper is called Development Aid and International Migration to Italy. Does aid reduce irregular flows? So thankfully, Sarah's done a lot of the motivation and the context for me, so that helps save some time. So thanks, Sarah. And just in general, if you have specific questions about the paper's published at the World Economy, so go there for any kind of details. And I'll try my best to give kind of a short overview now. So the motivation, very similar to what Sarah mentioned, is this very large spike in migration, but just partly in general, a kind of political feeling in some countries of a migrant crisis. And the kind of political response to this is that, under political pressure, donors started to commit large amounts of aid to reduce irregular migration. So one example is the €4 billion in this particular fund. And this is kind of explicitly given to address the root causes of instability, forced displacement, and irregular migration. But this is kind of part of a general trend of policymakers trying to use aid or sell aid as a way of reducing irregular migration. Now, at the same time, the academic literature has mainly been focused on regular migration. Okay, and this paper partly comes from my co-author Gabrielle, kind of leaving the migration NGO world and coming to do an MRes at UEA and being really frustrated and surprised by the academic literature. So I said, fine, can you do any better, essentially? So in the academic literature, we'll mention some of these, and they find a range of effects. So some finding a small negative effect from aid on regular migration, some finding a positive side. There are a couple of exceptions. So we just heard about this Dreyer paper, that's the one Sarah just spoke about. And that's using refugee stocks. Now the great benefit, as Sarah mentioned, of that data is that you're able to get at a bit of irregular migration, okay? And you can get a large time series and lots of countries. The potential weakness is that you're trying to infer changes from stocks, okay? So it might be that you're not able to pick up all of the changes in refugee flows because the data isn't directly capturing that, okay? There are two other papers that use asylum applications as well, one just this year by Murat as well. So our contribution here is to basically start trying to use different data, okay, as a complement to the paper we've just seen, and ask that question: does aid reduce or affect irregular migration? And we're using this nice new data for Italy as a representative data point for Europe. We've got the number of border crossings. This is quite a short time series. And we've got the number of asylum applications. This is a little bit longer. We can also just include regular migrants as a way of making our paper easy to compare to others. And then we're going to examine the effect of aid on irregular migration, controlling for a bunch of factors. We focus on just Italy, which means that we don't count people multiple times if they turn up in a transit country, the first European country, and then in Germany, and then in France. But it also potentially means kind of less external validity. So if the situation is very different in Spain or Greece, potentially we pay that cost, okay? So the model is a basic gravity model for migration, and we have some kind of fixed effects, either for year or for year in origin. And our specification, so for the dependent variable, we pick one of these three. So that's either asylum applications, border crossings, or regular migration. We then look at two types of aid. So that's either bilateral aid from Italy, that's the country we're interested in, and then from anyone else. And then a kind of standard set of other controls. So origin characteristics, GDP, unemployment, and so forth, and then a bunch of bilateral measures, policy restrictiveness, immigration stocks, how far away the country is, and so forth. We, as well as running that basic model, we run a host of different robustness checks. So we look at just if the country, if the recipient country, if the sending country is relatively rich or poor. We can include flows to other destinations. We can include FDI and remittances. We can include trade flows. Then, because of this potential endogeneity of aid and migration, we use the kind of three-stage least squares approach and essentially model that allocation of aid at the same time as modeling the flows of migration. Okay, so we can do those two in tandem. And then we also vary the lag of aid from 1 to 8 years. We'd love to be able to go back further as Sarah could, but our data isn't quite so, it doesn't go back as far. So in each case, we're testing two types of aid on 3 different kinds of migration. And we've got a huge number of different things we could, different specifications we could use. So we could do that and then just pick out a couple of results that fit our story, or just look for the stars, see when things are significant. But instead we try and kind of take a step back and look at what that body of evidence is saying. And particularly we try and really try and push this literature to be thinking about cost per deterred migrant. Okay, and this is the figure we're going to try and summarize all of our work in. It's just saying, okay, taking seriously this effect size, how much aid would you need to give to stop one migrant? Okay, it's so simple in academic research to find a couple of significant results and really focus on those. It's very tempting. And this is our way of putting the spotlight on effect size. Okay, and I'll summarize this in kind of 3 slides. And those are basically the different dependent variables we use. So, what is the effect of aid on asylum applications? Well, the estimates from the effect of Italian aid are all positive and range from 0.01 to 0.27. And it's significant at the 5% level about a quarter of the time. So what does that really mean? Well, the largest significant coefficient is 0.02. That would mean a 1% increase in bilateral aid from Italy to a given country is associated with a 0.02% increase in the number of asylum applications. So to really show you what that means, we'll take the example of Pakistan. And we pick Pakistan because it's the second biggest country in both categories. So it kind of feels like a fair and important country to think about. So here, one additional asylum application would be caused or is associated with an extra $162,000. Yeah, that's in 2010 prices, so a little bit larger today. Okay, I mean, essentially, we only find positive results. We don't find a deterrent effect at all on asylum applications. And even when, the best evidence we have shows that, it's not a large effect anyway. Okay, if you think $1 million extra might be associated with about 8 extra refugees, asylum applications. What about if we try and measure irregular migration using border apprehensions? Well, here we find different effect sizes, different sizes, but they're always small. And the only significant effect we find is at 10% for bilateral aid and for relatively rich sending countries. So again, we pick an example. Here it's Iraq because it has to be a richer country. Here we find the cost per deterred border crossing is $1.8 million in 2010 prices. It's so easy to get lost in regression tables, see significant results. But if you actually work through the numbers, I think it's very unlikely anyone's going to say, wonderful, let's increase aid for the reason of stopping people crossing borders. It's such a good deal at only $2 million per deterred migrant. Okay, so the effect sizes say there's a really small effect of aid on border apprehensions. What about if we look at regular migrants? Well, here most coefficients fall within a relatively narrow range. And if we use the 3-stage least squares coefficient, that's a little bit larger. And if we use that, this large effect, the largest effect we find, again, using Pakistan as an example, the implied figure is over $4 million per deterred migrant. Okay, thanks. So our summary is our consistent finding across different dependent variables, types of aid, various different specifications, is that the estimated effect size of development aid on migration is really small. Okay, that's regardless of whether it's positive or negative, and the various ways we try and measure irregular migration. We find instead robust evidence that irregular migration are significantly affected by conflict, by poverty, and by pre-existing stocks from that country. Essentially, if you have a large number of refugees or asylum seekers from a particular country, that network is going to increase the number of migrants you have. And aid will have very little effect, positively or negatively. So our kind of policy implication that we draw out, and this is captured a bit in the Economist article that wrote this paper up, is that aid doesn't meaningfully reduce migration, but it does meaningfully do lots of other things, such as increase growth, reduce poverty, and improve health outcomes. And so our implication from this work is aid should be used for those things and shouldn't be used to try and reduce migration. Thanks very much. I'll hand over.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. And before we go to the third presentation, can I just remind everybody, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box. We've already received some questions, but I'm sure there are more, so please keep that in mind. Okay, over to you, Mauro, for the third and final presentation before we go to the Q&A.
Okay, let me share the screen. Can you hear me? And can you see the presentation? Okay, great. So thanks a lot, Martin. So what I'm going to presenting in these 15 minutes is a joint work in progress, which co-authored with Marco Sanfilippo and Filippo Santi, which investigates so far relatively unexplored dimension of the aid migration link. That is the impact of foreign aid projects on internal migration in a developing country. So why do we believe that this topic matters? Why do we think like it makes sense doing research on this? So first, it's a matter of numbers. So the vast majority of the works of the contributions in this trend of literature, with the exception maybe of some analysis on cash transfer and credit access programs, are focusing on international migration. That is a particular type of migration, a particularly costly type of migration, and it represents a small share of the pie, a small share of total migration. So globally, 1 in 8 people are internal migrants, and these are 4 times as many as international migrants. So every time we are estimating the impact of foreign aid on international migration, we are implicitly leaving out the biggest portion of the pie, so the biggest share of migration. Second, in a context of, especially in the sub-Saharan context, characterized by a high aid dependency and a rapid and mostly out of control early urbanization. So we investigate the potential role of donors in driving internal mobility. And in doing so, we explore whether foreign aid might play a role in helping developing countries to better manage and, let's say, reduce the cost of rapid urbanization by creating more, I would say, spatially even development opportunities across districts. So at a theoretical level, the private decisions to move or stay are mainly driven by differentials in opportunities across locations. And these opportunities are mainly in the form of employment and earnings, so the classic Aris and Todaro model, so monetary dimensions of well-being, as well as availability and quality of amenities, such as the provision and the quality of public services. So we argue that in poor context, in deprived areas, the supply and the quality of amenities, as well as economic and employment opportunities, depend to a large extent by the provision of foreign assistance, by the role of donors. So the hypothesis is that, especially in aid-dependent countries, aid projects increase the relative attractiveness of the areas in which they are located, and this in turn shapes the incentives to migrate internally and drive population movements. So this is what we want to test. So more specifically, what this paper does is examining the role of foreign aid projects as a pull factor for internal migration in Malawi. So we want to test whether an increase in the number of VET projects in a particular district drives immigrants from other districts. So is positively associated to immigration associated with immigration from other districts. And we proceed in 3 steps. So first, we estimate the causal relationship between aggregate number of VET projects in a particular district and the inflows of migrants. And I said causal because we make an effort in corroborating our benchmark results with an IV, an instrumental variable strategy, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to describe now, but I would be happy to go through it in a Q&A session if required. And second, we perform a disaggregate analysis. So we are interested in a distinction between macro categories of foreign aid. As Sarah mentioned, foreign aid is not alike. So it might have like a different impact on the decision to immigrate in this case. So we are particularly interested in distinction of macro categories of social and economic infrastructures. And third, we explore the mechanisms, the channels through which foreign aid projects affect the decision to migrate. Is it this pull factor driven by the public services channel, so the role of foreign aid in improving local services and public services at local level? Is it because it enhances economic opportunities at local level, or both? So this is what the mechanism section is about. And how we do this? So we match IPUM census data on bilateral migration flows, internal flows in Malawi, with geolocalized aid data, and we estimate a gravity model for internal migration, district to district, over the period 1998-2008, and it's the period for which we have data. And then we provide, as I mentioned before, we provide evidence of a causal relationship between a project and internal migration, and we apply an instrument along the lines of the one implemented and described by Sarah in her paper. It's a shifter share with the 2 components described by Sarah. And we utilize the variability of nightlights and quality of services by using we make use of a different data set. We make use of survey data from Afrobarometer, and this is done to explore the channels, the mechanisms through which foreign aid influences the decision to migrate. So what we find that this pull factor effect not only is statistically significant with a star, as Paul mentioned, but also that the estimated impact is numerically and economically relevant. So if we move from the median to the 90th percentile, so moving, that is to say, moving from 0 to 5 aid projects, it roughly corresponds to an additional 930 immigrants per district, which is about 11% of the average number of migrants per district, which is a meaningful number in our view. And second, while we find effect of a pull factor, while we find evidence of a full pull factor effect, so the increase in number of projects in a given district attracting more immigrants from other districts, we do not find evidence of a push factor effect or retention factor effect. So it doesn't create more immigrants from the same district. And third, our estimates reveal that the positive welfare effects manifest themselves especially through an improved quality of public services in recipient districts. Why do we pick Malawi? So it's not only because we are able to match information on bilateral internal flows with geolocalized data on foreign aid projects. It is also because Malawi presents some desirable characteristics that are particularly suitable for this research question. So first of all, Malawi is highly dependent from foreign aid. Net official development assistance accounts for around a quarter of gross national income in Malawi. Malawi receives more in foreign aid than the country can collect through taxes. The expenditures in the health sector are for around 90% covered by foreign aid, and 99% of HIV expenditures are covered by foreign aid. The HIV is a big issue in Malawi. And the second reason is that Malawi has the highest internal migration rates in sub-Saharan Africa, and the population resides predominantly in rural areas, and we have a large share of internal migration that is from rural to rural areas, but we also have a very rapid increase in rural urban migration, one of the highest in the sub-Saharan continent. What do we use? As I anticipated earlier, we use a gravity model to estimate this, and in which bilateral migrant flows from district I to district J at time t are a function of our variable of interest, that is the number of foreign aid projects in a given district of destination. And in order to better identify our coefficient of interest, we include a very large set of fixed effects that absorb basically all the factors that are origin specific, so specific to the district of origin, and that are bilateral, dyadic specific, and time invariant. So for each pair of district. And we basically absorb all these effects. In terms of other controls, we keep our model fairly parsimonious because we have to. Unfortunately, there are not many variables available at district level for Malawi. So we use a district pair level. We include the stock variable, which proxies for the network effect. And at district level, we use Nightlight that proxies for economic opportunities and population, extreme weather conditions, and conflict. It's demi variable, which takes a value of 1 when there is an ongoing conflict in district destination, and 0 otherwise. And as an estimator, we use Poisson because it has some desirable characteristics when using gravity models applied to internal migration in general, especially when you've got like a share of zeros that is relatively high, and in our case, it's over 20%. So here are the results. So in the rectangle, you can see our coefficients of interest. That again is the effect of an increase in the number of ed projects at destination on bilateral immigration from other districts. The effect is with 3 stars, so it's positively statistically significant, and is robust to the inclusion of different controls whose effect is not statistically significant, especially because we don't have much variation for these controls, with the exception of the network effect that is always positive as predicted by the theory. Then what happens when we disaggregate by type of ed? Well, there are 2 main takeaway messages from this table. So first is that the overall foreign aid effect that we see from the other table, it seems to be driven predominantly by foreign aid in social infrastructures and the category other. The category other includes mostly multi-sector aid that is composed by mainly foreign aid in social services and support to NGOs. And the other takeaway message is that foreign aid in economic infrastructure is not significant. So it seems not to be a driver of internal migration in Malawi. What happens when we look at foreign aid as a push factor? So in this case, we are shifting the focus on emigration. So here we are looking at the effect of an increase in foreign aid projects on the number of emigrants from that district, on bilateral emigration from that district. And we see that the effect is not significant. So while we got a pull factor effect, So while we got like the number of immigrants that increase in response to especially in districts in which there is a relatively high concentration of foreign aid projects, an increase in aid projects doesn't create more immigrants. So we got a sort of a no migration effect at work and migration diversion effect. So this existing number of migrants is diverted away towards districts in which the concentration of aid projects is relatively high. So this is our interpretation. And then the mechanisms. So here we want to test whether the pull factor effect we just showed operates through the so-called income channel or the public services channel or both. So whether this effect operates through an increase, an improvement in terms of provision of public services or an improvement in terms of economic opportunities. And we proxy, so from column 2 to column 5, we estimate the effect of foreign aid projects on proxies for quality of social services. They are taken from Afrobarometer. So here the survey question we are interested in is whether there is a school, clinic, facility in general within easy walking distance. So we are shifting to individual data now. And we are estimating it with a linear probability model. So it's a 0, 1 in a dependent variable. And this exercise is coupled with what you see in column 1, that there is a simple regression on Nightlights, that is our proxy for the income channel. So while we have evidence, the results suggest that while we have the evidence of a public services channel at work, so while the effect seems to be operating through an improvement in terms of quality of and availability of public services, on the other hand, we don't have any income effect at work. So to conclude, as I said, our findings tell that the effect, the push factor effect I mentioned, is not only statistically significant, but also economically and numerically relevant. And while we do have an effect, a pull factor effect at work, we don't have a corresponding effect we don't have a corresponding push or retention factor effect. And our estimates reveal that the positive welfare effects driving internal migration manifest themselves predominantly through an improvement in the quality of local public services in recipient districts. So the implication is that if donors, the policy implication is that if donors carefully choose their target areas, and if foreign aid is not wasted, and donors try at least to send foreign aid and respond to recipient to what the recipient needs are, and do not act strategically or selfishly or send aid based on a simple network effect, for instance, their intervention might at least help to better manage the process of rapid urbanization and the associated high costs that are an issue in sub-Saharan countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauro. We have about half an hour for questions. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them into the chat box in YouTube. I suggest we do a brief round of first questions that relate to clarifications only. So, Sarah, I have a question from Maria Ahmad, who asks if you could please elaborate on the 9% aid comment. She didn't fully understand that. Paul, if you could please explain again how exactly, or how you calculated the cost of deterring a migrant. And Mauro, we had a question about what exactly you mean by nightlights. So we just do these clarifications first before we go into the substantive questions. Sarah.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for this very important point. I might have been a bit too fast. So what we wanted to do is basically we wanted to see whether different types of aid have a differential effect. And in particular, humanitarian aid would have been of interest because it's actually directed towards a quick disaster relief and emergency response. So what we did is we didn't include simply the total number of humanitarian aid, but rather interacted it with our total aid to see and to also provide more policy implication, where we could say at the end, like such amount of such a share of humanitarian aid would be needed to have effects on a rather short-term basis. And the 9% was not on a slide. You would have to calculate it from the model because it's an interaction model. And then you would have to see when there's a turning point, because in our short-run perspective, we have positive effects of total aid. But when you include the interaction was negative. And then you would have to look into the turning point. When does it switch from a positive to a negative effect? And this would be at 9%. That's it. Hopefully, I hope this is clarifying.
Thank you, Sarah. Paul?
Sure. So the cost per deterred migrant is essentially just a different way of summarizing the standard models you see in the literature. So the standard way of presenting is just to have a bunch of regression tables showing you the coefficient estimate, okay? And all we're doing is from a coefficient estimate, you see something like minus 0.02. And we think that isn't particularly easily understandable for a policymaker that doesn't, off the top of their head, know all of the specific numbers. So all we're doing is saying, well, what that coefficient means is a 1% increase in aid means that level of increase in the percentage of migration. So all we do is we pick a large representative country and then work out what a 1% increase in aid would be, and therefore just run the numbers. So it's a fairly simple change, but it's basically hopefully a better and more straightforward way of presenting the same results. That's me done.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, about Nightlight. Nightlight is the measure we use to proxy for economic activities and also population. And it's basically it's the nightlight luminescence in the district at destination taken from pictures from the satellite, so from above. So you can see at least like whether there is whether there are economic activities. So it's a rather rough proxy, and in the literature, like there is a big discussion about the measurement issues about Nightlight. The problem is that for Malawi, at least, we don't have anything better to use. So a district level is the only variable that you can use that proxies for what we are interested in adding as a control. So economic activities and local population. Unfortunately, as I said, we are in our empirical exercises, we are forced to be parsimonious because of lack of available data. And then in the literature, like Nightlight is widely used, and especially in developing countries, of course.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's go to the more substantive questions now. Sarah, there was a question actually from two people. And the question is, given that refugees may take some time, often several years, to reach host countries, apply and obtain asylum, how do you model the effect of aid without knowing when refugees actually left their home countries? And I'll give you a second question as well for you to think about. Melissa Siegel asks whether you have considered the potential effects of policy conditionalities that come with aid. So in a way that aid is given on the condition that countries make efforts to reduce outflows. So is that something that you have considered? We've had another general question about, maybe Paul, you could have a go at this one, and the others as well. is why offer non-hypothecated aid, so non-targeted aid at all? So this Stefan Markowski argues that aid should always be targeted and conditional. If you have any views on that, and maybe a comment on Mauro. I mean, because you do this, I think, as far as I understand, this is the first time that this kind of issue has been taken up in the context of internal migration. How do you see the main differences in terms of the mechanisms at play between internal migration and international migration in this debate? Maybe if you could address these questions in turn. Sarah, if you could have a go.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I will start with the second one directed at me. This was the one about the conditionality or so. And we on purpose did, like, for instance, the analysis that we were looking into aid flows to the neighboring countries to see whether donors make use of neighbors to basically outsource border controls or so. And there we saw that this has actually an effect. So we do find some of these conditionality effects. And also in the paper, we have some measures where we can see how recipient countries responded with respect to their return policy, with the repatriation policies. These measures are not available for the entire countries, but for those that we have a measure for, and for the few years where we have information, we also see that aid indeed affects those policies. So there is evidence for that people, that aid is attached to conditionalities. But keep in mind, in our study, we find less of that evidence because we are looking into exogenous aid. If we would look into aid just from a simple model without accounting for the endogeneity, we would probably find much more evidence along these lines, because aid is used on purpose to reduce flows or to strengthen border controls at the neighbors and so on. So yeah, we addressed it in different ways, and I think in the paper you can find more on that. On the other point about when do people leave the country, as we don't know this, and only see when they have been granted refugee status, this is of course an issue, and of course also something which is a big limitation, because it varies across donor countries, but also across recipient countries. What we do is, given that we have these long lag structures, so we consider the effects not only in one point in time, but for different points in time, and we go down to 15 years of lags. And we have two levels of analysis. One is at the yearly level, and one is at a 3-year period level, where we combine 3-year blocks. And this could also help around some of these fluctuations. And lastly, we also account for recipient country fixed effects. So the sending countries, we include those fixed effects, which would probably correlate, given that some countries are much further away. It takes them much longer to come to the OECD countries than others. And this would be captured in the fixed effects. But yeah, there's no, I don't know of a better way. We would need other data for that, which we don't have for the very broad picture that we wanted to address in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Sure. So I'll just share my screen again, just on the how do you take into account that it can take a very long period of time. So one of the things we do in our paper is basically just to test each of the lags, which is a very similar approach to what Sarah is doing. And you can see here, this graph, for example, top left, you're just finding very, very similar results. Okay. And so if you imagine that most people are taking 1 year or 2 years or 8 years, and that's how long it's taking for effects to filter through, we're not finding particularly different effects. Okay. All we're finding normally, for example, here on the bottom left, is that our data is slightly weaker because we're losing years of data with every additional lag we take. So we can't know that, but the best tests we can do don't indicate that that's really kind of undermining the general results in the literature. On the second question of hypothecated aid, I wonder if that's partly because of the phrase I use of cost per deterred migrant. So that really is just a way of trying to summarize the effect sizes. It's not saying we're paying and then they're stopping someone coming and then we give them money. So I wonder if that's the the reason for that question. But if it's not, and it is about in general aid conditionality and so forth, my reading of the literature, I really lament the loss of general budget support. I think if we care about things like transaction costs, if we care about the ability to for governments to plan long term, if we think aid effectiveness is undermined by fragmentation, then being able to give aid with relatively few strings attached is a really good thing. So I would say, in general, as a general rule, I'm not sure exactly where the perfect point is, but we're too far in the conditional, in the kind of conditions on aid perspective, and I'd want to push it a bit more unconditional. That would be my take on the literature. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Mauro, before we move on to you, I'm just wondering, Paul and Sarah, if you could maybe say a little bit about how you think your papers actually speak to each other, because of course, Paul has an element in his analysis that looks at asylum seekers. And if I've followed correctly, Sarah does find a difference between short run and long run. How would you can relate, how does your analysis relate to that difference that Sarah identified, Paul?
Sure. So I'm happy to start, or if you're happy to. So, I mean, I think basically the ideal data set doesn't exist. And so what we're doing is essentially trying to get at different bits of data of how we can measure irregular migrants. Okay. And the way that Gabrielle and I decided to go about it was use this new data that hasn't really been explored. So number of border crossings, number of asylum applications. Now, they're not perfect because they don't go back very far, and we're just using for Italy. And then that means we have certain weaknesses in our paper, but it also means we have certain strengths. And it means that we really know what we're measuring. And we can be quite sure on that. And it's during the period that kind of policymakers are kind of most interested in. My take of Sarah's paper is that because you have a much longer time series and many more countries, that means you can do all kinds of really nice things, like looking at much longer lags, looking at neighbors or transition countries, which we can't really do. But that all comes with the proviso of the fundamental data you're using is trying to back out flows rather than measuring flows directly. And so I would see our papers as kind of complementary in that we're different perspectives on exactly the same problem. Feel free to undercut me and say something completely different. Over to you, Sarah.
Sarah, do you want to add to that briefly?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think, Paul just was speaking about the most important point. It's the data question. And I think like basically our two papers are the trade-off between internal and external validity of it. Yeah. Because it's always a discussion whether you want to have this very broad story for which you, unfortunately, in many cases don't have the very exact, precise data where you can understand really why did this individual decide to do what. Whereas Paul's data goes much more in this direction where they can understand much more what's really going on the ground. So. And this is really about external and internal validity. I think you always have to ask yourself before you start a project what you really aim at, and whether it's something that you want to direct to policymakers, which sometimes just want to know, but on average, what's the story, right? Sometimes they don't want to know maybe what's about Italy, but for others, it might be even more interesting to know much precisely what's going on in Italy to come up with very precise policy implications. So it's a lot about that. I think some of the postponed effects is really because I don't have these asylum seekers, but those people that have been granted refugee status, which again takes a bit longer. And also the causal analysis is different. So to some extent, this can also lead to another postponing effect, or another point in time when the effect really hits basically the stars in the table, which which we sometimes are all looking for. No, but yeah, it's just a bit of two sides of a medal, maybe, with how you can see it also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Mauro.
Yeah, I can respond to your question, Martin, about international migration. Well, the difference, of course, like also for the case of Malawi, but it applies to any country. Like it's a matter of costs and benefits. So for international migration, you got higher costs. Like think of the visa costs. Think of the psychological costs of adjusting to of settling to a new country, adjusting to the new culture, to the new norms. The costs are obviously higher with respect to internal migration. But on the other hand, for international migration, you got also higher benefits, the higher returns, the higher salaries you can have, like in OECD countries, for instance. So it's think of the basic Aristotle model. So it's just a matter of cost and benefits, difference between the two. And going back to our work. We do actually an exercise on international migration that I haven't included here because we are a bit skeptical including it in our paper because it departs a little bit from the standard gravity model that we are focusing on. But still, we got information on international migration, and we find like a null effect which corroborates the zero push factor effect that we got for internal migrants. So in this sense, like the two results are quite consistent. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I'll ask a question while we wait for a couple of more questions, maybe. So that's a broad question, so feel free to answer this in any way you see fit. But the broad topic that you're working on, as I said before, is obviously of huge policy interest. And we've had quite a bit of research and a lot of policy debate about, in general, the relationship between development and migration, foreign aid and migration. And we've discussed the U-shaped hypothesis. I mean, how would you situate your own work vis-a-vis those big debates? I mean, I know that some of your work has been picked up in the press. How do you kind of respond to questions, to very general questions, often in the policy debates about, so what does it all mean in terms of the bigger picture? Because my own reading, and I'm not an expert on this particular topic, of some of the kind of characteristics of the past debate was that we often had very strong arguments, very categorical arguments of the relationship is either this or that, and whereas it seems to me that some of this work that you're doing introduces some nuance that by looking at different categories, maybe specific countries. But how would you engage or like to kind of contribute to this bigger debate with your research? Sarah, do you want to start, or do you want to think first and have somebody else there?
No, I think I can go ahead. I think like one of the main stories we can just say is that we can only hope for politicians that are a bit more long-term oriented, because if they all stick to being so short-sighted, we will not find the effects, because then at most they will provide humanitarian aid, which would be, from my perspective now, good, because we were showing it can reduce flows, but does it really mean good, effective for the people that might need to flee from a conflict or so? And the only thing that we can hope for is really some more politicians and enact in more long-term oriented aid projects, which can then actually lead to grow for what also I think Paul directed to, that there are many other channels via which we can hope for some effects of development aid, but we will not see these immediate effects from also the perspective of the people that have to flee. So like this, the long-term versus short-term perspective is something I think where the literature was sometimes a bit short on. So because also it's not easy to identify effects, time panels have not been so long, and we can now go much further back and have much more implications about that. And about this, relating it to the last to the session on the migration, so at least what we now see is again that we would say, given that aid leads to more growth, we also find the fact that it reduces flows, which would be from the perspective of development, achieving development, a very positive, actually a positive outcome, but only at a very long term. sorry, I'm keeping, being repetitive now, so I better stop.
Thanks, Sarah. Paul?
Sure. So I'd be interested to know what Gabrielle's answer for this is, partly because he's the reason I wrote the paper. So coming from a kind of migration background, I blame him for roping me into this. But my own answer to this is, so there was definitely a sense in the political sphere. There's this large push for aid being 0.7% of GDP. And then there's a bit of a sense, especially in the UK, that potentially that's going to be politically unpopular after a while. Okay, that after that large increase in aid, that potentially the government's looking around for ways of justifying that budget. And so I really felt that it was important to be clear-sighted in what aid is and isn't good at. And I am completely convinced by the kind of good, careful, causal work showing that aid increases growth and reduces poverty and so on. And I felt quite uncomfortable with the kind of policy debate trying to justify aid in order to stop migrants coming here. And I think as much as possible, we should try, as academics, we have the kind of the joy and the responsibility to answer questions neutrally and carefully. Politicians can't always do that, so on and so forth, but we can. And I felt it's important to say, is it true that aid can reduce migration, regardless of whether that's a policy goal or not? And I think we definitely found that that's not really the case. So that was my kind of hope, I suppose, in my reflection. Thanks.
Thank you. Mauro?
Yeah, so regardless of whether or not the hump actually exists, because this is probably not well, I don't find it so well established, but I agree. So if you take like our results seriously, if you want to like reduce migration flows from developing countries by using aid, well, it's simply unrealistic. Like it just doesn't work. And I agree that this debate doesn't make much sense. It makes sense at the academic sense. It makes sense working on it at academic level, but thinking that foreign aid must be devoted to improve the economic development opportunities in developing countries. So regardless of its effect on migration, that's the main message that politicians should understand. Yeah.
As a question has come in, maybe to all of us. We've partly covered it already, but the question relates to the effects of, as far as I understand, the nature of foreign aid. Do different types of aid make a difference? I think all of you covered this in one way or another. So when we kind of say what research has to say about this relationship, would you make a point that it depends on the type of foreign aid and there are really big differences? Do you think that's a productive way of kind of taking the debate forward? To what extent do different types of aid make a difference, and to what extent do we have to consider that? Whoever wants to start with that. Mauro, maybe.
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on the context. So, for instance, if you think of developing country like Malawi, like people move for many reasons. But for instance, you got like a big HIV problem in Malawi. So, and people tend to for these reasons, they tend to move because they're looking for better healthcare opportunities, better healthcare conditions. So so better public services. So what we find in the mechanisms, it tells that basically just The pull factor effect is predominantly driven by an improvement in public services, which, given the kind of issues that Malawi is facing, is not surprising at all. So it is referred to another strand of literature, especially by a scholar called Levitz, who did a lot of work on Malawi, who found basically that infection and migration, HIV infection and migration in Malawi are closely connected. And so given in this context, what we find that the pull factor is mostly driven by improvements in public services, is not surprising.
Sarah and Paul, would you want to add anything? Sarah?
Yeah, I would be happy to add. I think this goes a bit back also to the whole discussion on ownership. So who should decide about where and which aid projects will be implemented? So there's a very large discussion on that in the literature also. I think what we have to keep in mind here before really maybe digging into what are the sectors or so, we should also distinguish between multilateral aid and bilateral aid. So my study, for instance, was on bilateral aid, where a lot of the motivation of political motivations by the donors are playing into, and which you can only hardly isolate from these political interests of the donor countries. But you might want to, maybe more literature should go also into like how multilateral aid affects that, and in particular on our focus on refugees and migrations and migration more generally. It would be super cool to have more data through which organizations also bilateral aid is channeled. So now for me, it would have been also, for instance, super interesting to see which aid is channeled through UNHCR to really get a better understanding of that. And maybe I would see it more to both is interesting, obviously, the sectors and multilateral versus bilateral, but to detach it from political interest, it's probably more the direction of dividing between multilateral and bilateral. Okay. And also just adding tomorrow, it always depends on the context. You might always have to consider which other foreign policy measures are at play. So for instance, in conflict countries, sometimes you have peace keeping personnel there, or you have military personnel there. There's also, again, a lot of interplay between these that you have to take care of. So there's still room for a lot of research, I would say.
Thanks. I'll give Gabriele a chance to contribute to this as well and to kind of give us his views on this research. But Paul, you wanted to say something before?
Yeah, just on the specific point about cutting up different kinds of aid. There's this difficult tension, I think, in the research, because it's clearly the case that different kinds of aid, we expect them to have different effects. It's also the case that if you take random numbers and then cut up the data set into lots of different bits and regress each of those different bits on each other, we're more likely to find significant effects that aren't really there. And so there's this tension when we're trying to, and one of the problems is that, in a sense, we're kind of too clever and creative, because if you get a bunch of economists in a room and say, hey, I found this exciting result, this particular kind of aid has a positive effect, whereas others don't. Normally, we're clever enough to come up with a plausible story that explains why that must be the case. Okay, I don't want to be too kind of negative or so on this front, but I just think that there's this tension in the literature, because it's difficult to get the causal effect from the general. And then if we're looking for 20, 30, 50, 100 different effects, potentially we're going to accidentally end up kind of finding effects that aren't really there, and that in follow-up studies aren't significant. But I too, Martin, sorry.
Yeah, just adding to this, sorry. And also the problem with the multi-sector analysis is that the effects sometimes are interlinked. So it's not easy like to single out the effect. So for instance, you've got like a net project on building an hospital, for instance, and of course the effect is higher if you got like a road that is close enough. So it's very difficult to disentangle, but I mean, we did it, like, and I'm speaking for our paper, just to try to corroborate the idea we had in mind about this public services channel work, and combine it with the mechanisms. So yeah.
Thank you. Gabriele, I'd like to bring you in as well. If you have any specific comments on kind of the state of the research, and where do you think it should be going in the future as well?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Just to add on this point, actually, during the review phases, we discussed with Paul, as we were actually asked by some reviewers to do some sectorial analysis. And at the end, we decided not to go for it because we felt at the macro level, we were not able to disentangle the different impact of different sectors of aid because of how the data is recorded. For example, different donors recording very similar projects and activities under different sectors. That might just increase the noise when you look at small subsets of aid. And going back a little bit to the more general question of development migration, as Paul said, my hope going into more academic positions and doing this research was, and the reason why we tried and in the paper include a way to convey the message that is understandable to non-academics, giving specific numbers for cost per deter migrant, was that if policymakers are convinced that in the short term aid is not an effective tool to deter migration, maybe we can bring back aid to do what it's supposed to and kind of clean a little bit the debate around migration. It's probably a good thing that migration was now included in the SDGs. I'm not sure the focus on reducing irregular migration, however phrased, will do any good to the development policy, development sector, and aid specifically. So I hope all these papers that are going out there will someday contribute to kind of clean the debate and bring back development to do development.
Thank you. Yeah, we're almost out of time, but maybe I'll raise one more quite specific question, and it's for, I think, for Gabriele and Paul. It's a similar question to the one that I already asked of Sarah. So the question is that since foreign aid can reduce irregular migration through incentivizing the recipient countries basically to deter outflows, is that something that you have considered? And I know that in your analysis you include a policy component, so you include a measure for restrictiveness, but I understand this is about immigration policies. But what about this idea that some recipient countries of foreign aid might actually make efforts to reduce outflows, as was, for example, the explicit aim of the EU-Turkey statement a while ago?
Gabriele, do you want to take, or I don't mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in our analysis, we use both policy level entry restriction as well as accounting for bilateral agreements or agreements at the European level with countries. So we have a kind of a pre-post dummy variable for agreement exactly such as the one with Turkey or the MOU with Libya and etc. So what we find should be the effect of a net to the existence of those agreements.
Okay.
And you know, that effect would then be in that the effect of aid on migration coefficient, right? So if the effect could be through incentivizing Tanzania to stop people leaving, and we don't find that, right? It's on top of any policy restrictions. Yeah.
Yes, except I suppose for the policy debates, of course, we want to know what the mechanism is in a way. I mean, the effect is important, but then politically speaking, you know, the types of mechanisms that generate the effect, you know, whether it's individuals' behavior or it's government stopping people from leaving, in the broader debate, this is obviously a key issue as well.
Indeed, and there's obviously you know, Sarah's work gets more towards the being able to look at those transit countries or the neighbours, which we're not able to do as much. So, I mean, that would be another obvious hope some policymakers would have. I mean, we don't find evidence of it, but we can't say as much about that.
Okay, fantastic. Looking at the time, I think we should draw this to a close. So I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in. We managed to keep the attention of a significant number of people, so thank you for sticking with us. I'd like to thank all our speakers for really interesting presentations and for very good discussion. And I'd like to remind everybody that there will be more webinars. And in fact, on the 9th of November, there will be a whole online conference organized by the Migration Policy Center on the role migrants play in shaping the resilience of essential services during the COVID pandemic. So if you're interested in that, please check out our website and register for that event. And with that, I'll wish you a nice rest of the day, and thank you very much again. Goodbye.